Down in Jungle Town, the moon shone down, without a frown, soon a shy babble came out the spoon.
During the mid-19th to early 20th century, the rise of booming industries and advanced machinery led to the Second Industrial Revolution in America. However, corruption within these industries soon followed. Upton Sinclair spoke out against the meat industry through the publication of The Jungle in 1906, which directly targeted the industry's grotesque conditions and abusive treatment of workers, including women. After the American public learned of these hidden practices, they were horrified and demanded reform. These demands were successful shortly after, which led to the temporary Meat and Food Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. In addition, it led to the foundation of the Food and Drug Association, an essential part of America today.
The women's suffrage movement was an important piece of long-term context tying into our topic, as Sinclair clearly presented women's oppression throughout his novel. The March for Women's Suffrage began during the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. This is where the right to vote was controversially brought up, and abolitionist Frederick Douglass later became one of the most passionate fighters for it. His ideas shared during the convention kick-started the entire women's suffrage movement and inspired women's fight for equality in America. Women's struggle for rights such as voting and personal liberties were then carried on through decades and echoed throughout the jungle. I did not put into the jungle 1/10 of what I know about the oppression and abuse of women. Upton Sinclair.
The main long-term context that leads into our topic is working life within the Second Industrial Revolution. After the war, the economy was reconstructed, and the 19th and 20th century was the start of fast-paced mechanical production in America. This brought down labor costs for employers and significantly lowered the prices for consumers when purchasing said goods. Unfortunately, this led to a swift pace of work, and employees of the factories were forced to work extremely long hours. These conditions led to the birth of labor unions. Employees founded unions to fight for their grievances due to this new method of supreme industrialization. The introduction of the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th to 20th century leads us to a better understanding of the jungle. It gives new insight into the struggles people faced at the time and the birth of labor unions.
Packingtown, Chicago was the center of the meat production factories of the Second Industrial Revolution. Many immigrants migrated here in search of a job within the factories. However, they were not being paid enough to support their families. As a result, the workers challenged their employers by striking in hopes of a minimum wage of 20 cents an hour. Unfortunately, the strike did not go well for them, since there were always more immigrants and Americans who needed work. Connollation states, as many as 5,000 people line up outside the stockyards each morning to replace the strikers. This further solidifies that the industry would not change. Through the refusal of higher wages, keeping lower wages meant that the industry could continuously grow. It was from this strike that Upton Sinclair decided to work undercover in the Packingtown yards and gain material for his book.
Our topic is how The Jungle by Upton Sinclair displayed American abuse during the early 20th century. The Jungle was published on February 26 of the year 1906 and brought an uproar throughout early industrial America. This uproar was due to the American people being in absolute shock at the horrendous conditions of the meatpacking industry, such as rotting meat, disease, and human body parts mixing into the meat. Additionally, Sinclair hoped to show them the extreme abuse and manipulation that workers were facing at the time. But unfortunately, the American public had their eyes set on the disgust of the meat industry and primarily focused on this through them writing various letters to the president. This ultimately led to Upton Sinclair directly communicating with President Theodore Roosevelt due to the extensive requests from the public. I wished to frighten the country by a picture of what its industrial masters were doing to their victims. Entirely by chance, I had stumbled on another discovery, what they were doing to the meat supply of the civilized world. In other words, I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach.
More specifically, the rights of Americans were violated, such as unsafe working conditions, abuse of workers, and dangerous production in meat. In turn, these workers were extremely oppressed and refused to speak out against the maltreatment of the industry for fear of losing their jobs and homes. They were hushed and afraid of their bosses because they knew that they were helpless in their hands. They had no rights. They were as much the property of their employers as the cattle they slaughtered. The Jungle, Upton Sinclair. Moreover, they worked in factories covered head to toe in filth, including animal blood, rotten meat, and even dead rats. And there are not merely rivers of hot blood and carloads of moist flesh, and rendering vats and soup cauldrons, glue factories and fertilizer tanks that smell like the craters of hell. There are also tons of garbage festering in the sun, and the greasy laundry of the workers hung out to dry, and dining rooms littered with food, black with flies, and toilet rooms that are open sewers. The jungle, Upton Sinclair. This filth within factories was a breeding ground for disease which caused illness among workers and also among those who consumed the meat. The horrors of death from food poisoning were prevalent during the Spanish-American War of 1898 when the public learned how many men died from rotten meat sourced from America. Since there were no federal laws against food production, no charges could be held against the military, which only riled up the public even more.
Furthermore, Upton Sinclair discusses the oppression against working women, such as the fact that working women were forced to work unpleasant jobs and did not receive nearly the same pay as men did. On top of that, working women did not have the luxury of relying on a man's protection, which countered old gender roles. The girl was a working machine, a thing to be used, and in the end, thrown away. She had been brought to this place to do the work of a man, but she had been made to pay the price of a woman. The jungle, Upton Sinclair. No matter how similar these working women were to working men, they would still be undervalued in the workplace. Women did not have recognizable rights and were victims of exploitation, abuse, and sexual violence. And the men began to talk to her, low and intimate, and the girl had no defenses against them. They were masters of the world, and she was only a slave to them. The jungle, Upton Sinclair.
In order to spread awareness of the industries, Upton Sinclair took the responsibility of collecting information by going undercover for 7 weeks in the Chicago yards. He wrote numerous notes and gathered interviews of fellow workers within the yards. Despite being rejected for his novel being too grim and grotesque, Sinclair pushed, saying that he had to tell the truth and let people make of it what they would. He continued to suffer multiple rejections until Isaac Marcosson, a fan of Sinclair, presented it to his boss. Ultimately, after strenuous efforts, the novel was published, which displayed Sinclair's determination and responsibility.
The Meat and Food Inspection Act was created after the public began to take notice of the novel. This was through President Roosevelt, who, with the help of Upton Sinclair, established the Meat and Food Inspection Act on June 30th, 1906. This was put into place to prevent spoiled meat and unsanitary conditions within the meat industry. Previously, there were meat inspectors within the meat industry. However, these were plain inspection visits, which gave the employers just enough time to maintain presentability before they arrived. After this temporary act was put into place, it truly helped regulate misbranded food as well as sanitary conditions with unplanned visits at the time. Additionally, the Pure Food and Drug Act was also passed on June 30th, 1906 by President Theodore Roosevelt to ensure healthy and clean production of food, as well as making sure unsafe chemicals were not being put on this food. Companies now had to properly label all of their foods, detailing everything that went into their production. This act had such a pivotal impact because previously Americans would combat food poisoning every day that was sourced from greedy industrial tyrants.
The enactment of a pure food law was a recognition of the fact that public welfare outweighs the right to private gain, and that no man may poison the people for his private profit. Theodore Roosevelt. These two acts then collectively led to the establishment of the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates food and meat production with the help of the United States Department of Agriculture. The FDA verifies labeling, game inspection, and sanitary conditions. Disease and spoiled meat are considered adulterated and may not be sold. Furthermore, this also includes drugs. However, the meat industry is more the main focus concerning our topic. The foundation of the FDA is essential in understanding the current lasting impact that our topic has. From Sinclair bringing light to the darkness of these industries, we can now safely trust regulations within our food and drug consumption, which is an integral part of our day-to-day life as Americans.
The publication of The Jungle led to multiple reforms, which occurred both directly after its publication and decades after. However, if Sinclair decided to never highlight the conditions and abuse within the meat industry, we would not have these same practices in place. It would be a violation of our rights not being given the proper information and being deceived about the food being consumed. Additionally, we would not have as much information about the oppression that working women faced in their society and the horrors that they were subjected to. Fortunately, Sinclair took a firm stand and used his rights as an American to bring change responsibly. His rights include freedom of speech and of the press. As Americans, it is our responsibility to use our given rights to fight against oppression as Sinclair did.